Good evening. Welcome to Moto Talk with Steve and Kim. Today we are talking about vintage motorcycle ownership. Should I own one? What should I expect when owning a vintage motorcycle? And much more. We have a lot of experience between the both of us and a lot of our friends in the community, and especially on the subject of vintage motorcycles. Shout out to Facebook pages, Indianapolis Vintage Motorcycles, Indianapolis Classic Motorcycles, and of course, all of you watching either now live or later when it stops and records and it's up in the cloud somewhere. So let us know in the comments if you can hear us okay.
Hope you got dug out today.
We'll continue from there. Yeah, I hope you've been safe today. If you didn't know, it snowed the last couple days.
A little bit.
And anyway, Greg McKenzie, thank you. Thumbs up. He must hear us. Either that or he just likes us being not hearing us. All right. Well, hey, as we wait for more people to tune in, I'll tell you about my first vintage motorcycle. And this was, I don't know, 10 or 12, 13 years ago. And I picked up my first vintage bike. It was a 1967 Honda Dream 305. And although it was a running and riding bike, there were several issues that popped up right away as I started to get familiar with it. And I had some decent basic mechanical skills in other areas, other hobbies that I had been in through the years, including RC stuff and fixing houses. And my mom and dad had rentals growing up. Anyway, these skills helped me transition into vintage motorcycle repair. Another example of that would be one of our mechanics, Mike Hubert, who came from the aircraft side. So that's the aviation.
Yeah, he was an airframe and power plant mechanic for 4 decades. So he knows recips and turbines.
That's right.
Quite skilled. Different world, but skilled.
Yeah. Anyway, a couple of those fixes that I had to do. One was an oil leak, and I just kind of cleaned the engine and traced where the oil leak was coming from, and it was an easy fix. There were a couple of electrical issues, and I had a missing switch housing, the bottom half, and I forget what side it is. I think it was the headlight side on the left. And I had joined a community. If this was back when the forums were really big and not necessarily Facebook as much. And we, once I joined that forum, I found someone, and he actually gave it to me and just sent it to me and said, "Here you go. I have one hanging around," and I put it on there and it worked.
Yeah, forums are great. I mean, one of the people that joins our call regularly is a gentleman in Evansville, Barry.
Oh, yeah. And, Barry Schonberger.
You know, he helped me greatly on a number of different things where I've had even a very obscure part, and he's had it and sent it along, and we've traded some things. He'd been another one of those kind of people that's really good in the vintage community generally.
Yes. Very, very good. He's bought stuff off of me, and I bought stuff off of him. You have done the same thing. So what's a vintage bike that you bought back in your early adulthood that you had to?
Well, for me, vintage bikes weren't all that old when I bought my first one. I think my first motorcycle at all would qualify as a vintage bike now. It was a 1966 Honda Super 90, but it was only 2 years old when I bought it. And that was altogether different. And, you know, for me, I learned a lot on that one, but I made the same kinds of errors other people do when they're 15 years old. I immediately started hacking it up, sawed the muffler off, put on a straight pipe, put, you know, different air cleaner covers on it, threw away some parts that now are nearly priceless because you can't find them. And those are issues that we didn't know about when we bought them new back in the day. But it's one of the reasons why vintage bikes have a big community of interest now, because there's a lot of them. Honda in particular made a lot of motorcycles. There was somebody last show was asking about the step through version of the new 125 that's like a step through 50. Honda made over 100 million of those, and they're still in production. CB 350s are another example of what Honda made a lot of. In 1973, I think the number is that Honda made more CB 350s than all the other motorcycle manufacturers made motorcycles combined. And that was a lot. And I think it's somewhere north of 500,000 of them by then.
Is that all around the world or just
everywhere? Yeah, no, not just US. They just made a lot of them. So I think my first real vintage bike that I considered a vintage bike was a Triumph Bonneville that I bought out of a shed, and I bought it in Carmel. They had no idea what it was, but it was broken, and
Oh,
it had
okay.
sat there for many years, and I still have that
You
bike.
still have that one.
Yep, but I think that was the first one I bought that would have been considered a vintage bike then.
Yeah.
It was probably in about 1978 or 80, something close to that.
Gotcha. All right. Well, hey, let's get into this. Yeah, Keith, we're not going to cover putting vintage air in the tires this particular show. We might have to have you on to discuss that. Hey, here's the question. I love vintage motorcycles and I want to buy one. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big consideration. I mean, for me, I want to start at 100,000 feet for everybody. First of all, if you think you want one, you've done some research, you have an attachment to a particular brand, be patient while you're looking for it. Don't just jump out and buy the first one you see. Talk to some people, look at different things. Don't get emotionally attached to it right away, or you could buy the wrong bike or pay too much money for it. So do a little bit of research on what a cheap one of that type is and what an expensive one might be, and the differences between the low cost and higher cost. Make sure you know how common the bike is if you're buying your first vintage bike, because if it's an uncommon bike, you could step into it without necessarily knowing you got over your head quickly. If you show a picture of the Dream as an example, like Steve's first vintage bike, that's a terrific choice because they're abundant, they're inexpensive to fix. To get one that looks really good like this is a stretch, but you can spend a lot less money than you could on some other bikes. So this is a definite yes for a vintage bike. In this category, there's a definite no. It would be this one. And there's a lot of reasons why, even though they become vintage bikes now, that's not a good place to start because Ducatis require a special skill set. They're expensive to fix, get parts for, even though they're inexpensive to buy. So it's sort of like a free puppy if you buy a Ducati. It costs a lot of money in the longer run. I don't recommend it.
And what about the return on your money, the Ducati versus those are probably in the same. What's that Ducati worth versus the Honda Dream?
Yeah, so that Dream's probably a $4,500 bike, maybe plus or minus.
Now, probably.
That Ducati, even in the condition it's in, is only about a $3,000 bike, but it could easily cost $3,000 to maintain that bike in 2 years. Whereas that Honda, if you have that one, you pay $4,500 for it, and it's a really good runner.
If you just keep,
you could probably ride it for 10 years and not spend $100 on it.
Right.
Not so much with a Ducati. So that's one of the reasons why that's not a good idea. Be realistic about what you're going to do with it. Are you going to use it very much? And if you expect to use it very much, it has to be in good shape when you're ready to begin riding it. You can't be compromising on its safety or the condition in that situation. Make sure you understand that you can get parts easily for your first vintage bike. If you try to buy something that is hard to get parts for, you're going to spend a lot of downtime, and that may not be your goal. Make sure that if you can fix it, that you can fix quite a bit of it yourself. The simpler ones, like a Honda Dream, are going to be a lot more friendly to deal with than something more complicated.
Right.
You can also make sure that if you buy one, to Steve's point, if you're going to buy it, if it's your intention to sell it, then keep that in mind. Right. You don't want to buy it, spend a lot of money on it, and then turn around and find out you didn't really make any money or you lost a significant amount if you were going to sell it right away. So you're better off buying something that meets your expectations right up front. From there, we make a presumption that you've picked one, you've bought it. Now, what are you going to do with it? And let's presume that the thing is in running condition and it's safe and you can use it. Then you've got to decide what you're going to do with it longer term. And that includes storing it when you're not riding it. Mm-hmm. And vintage bikes are different than modern bikes in that regard, because if you have one and you can store it inside, you're going to be far better off than if you can't store it inside in a controlled environment. Vintage bikes are going to have issues with the fuel system. They're going to have issues with the electrical systems. They're going to have issues with the running gear. And all of that is going to be more complicated if you store it outside versus inside. You got to think about how you're going to store it generally. If you want to store it inside, one thing you might consider is taking the tank off of it, draining all the fuel out of it, taking the battery out, putting it on a battery tender. They sound simple, but these are things that'll be better for you in the long run and keep you out of a workshop where somebody's got to do major work.
Now, I rarely keep mine on a tender all winter long. Of course, this is my home shop here, so it's climate controlled to an extent. I've got a gas heater. I've got I sometimes have a window unit for AC in the summertime,
Yeah.
but I may unhook the battery and then I'll tender it a couple days before I know I'm going to ride it, type of thing. You know
Yeah,
what I
that
mean?
the difference there is whether you buy a maintainer or a tender,
Right.
and the maintainers will turn themselves on, turn themselves off. And if you're using a conventional battery, I know one of the notes you made was about AGM batteries. They're going to behave differently when they're on a
Right.
battery manager.
What about wintertime? Tender all winter?
I tender them all winter
Okay.
because if you've got a lead acid battery, a normal cheap lead acid battery, they won't sulfate if they turn on and turn off the maintainer. If you've got a normal battery tender and it's just on all the time, it'll sulfate
Right.
the battery and ruin
Right.
it.
It's
So you've
got
got
to
to
be
have
a
a
high
smart
quality
one.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to have a smart tender that allows the battery to drain its power down and then bring it back up slowly. And you should also consider if you're putting it on a tender, don't put it on something that's more than 1.5 to 2 amps, even under strong
Right.
conditions, because it's very hard to recover a battery once it starts to go. And you should really, if it's a lead acid battery, you're going to be really fortunate if you get 3 years out of it.
Brad Bath, I don't drain my tanks. Now I don't have as many bikes as I used to, so I'm only maintaining 3 or 4 vintage bikes. And I don't drain my tanks. Now I may drain the bowls, every once in a while, but I still start my bikes up, once a week or once every other week or so. Now the difference between a shop like this and maybe one of our warehouse one or warehouse two, is those are not heated. So
right, and what gets you in those kind of places is the fact that they get hot and cold different times, and it causes condensation, and the condensation winds up in the gas tank or even inside the engine sometimes. One way to abate that a little bit is if you have a fan going all the time, even if it's in a cold environment, it's moving air all the time.
Yeah.
That's a way to help that. So if
what
you
about
have
a full tank
I
with a
personally
little bit of stable?
I think it's better if you just put regular old gasoline
Yeah.
in there with maybe even some oil with it. Shake it around, and even if it smokes a little when you start it back up,
Yeah.
it's a better thing. But it's just another way to do that.
Yeah. Now, what's kind of funny is Keith and I talk about this all the time. Not the warehouses, but I've got a riding lawnmower that like stays outside half the time, in the shed some of the time, gets all weathered on. That thing fires up every time. I've never cleaned the tank, maybe change the oil every other year.
Well, my snowblower's like that.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
put it up on the shelf and it sits
And then
there.
a vintage bike, some of them are good and some of them just take everything to get them started if you don't keep the juices flowing.
And the thing about draining the tank is really about how difficult is it going to be for you if you don't do it. If you don't do it and then you have issues and the fuel stays in there and it evaporates and causes all the goo to lay in the carburetors,
Right.
you got to take it apart and fix it. It's different if you've got a CB100 and you have to take the carb off and clean it, than it would be if you have a CBX and you got to take that apart, or this and take it apart. It's a much bigger job. So it has a lot to do with what bike you choose. But for me, one thing to consider if it's going to be stored for a long time, like all winter long, is you can drain the tank, open the cap, even take it off the bike and set it inside.
So
if you can't take the bike inside, you can
I have another battery question. This is something we could go on and on about with the batteries. Of course, Randy was just saying, a fully charged battery before installation. Some people say when you fill an acid battery, not the AGM where it's already filled for you and enclosed, you fill it up and you let it sit for an hour before you charge it.
Yeah, you have to, because
that's very important.
It allows the acid in the battery to soak into the plates and get all the air out of it. And a lot of times after the hour, should bounce it on the table a little bit to get the air to come back out of it and make sure it's full.
Gotcha. Let's move on to a couple things that you can check when you want to go buy a bike. And I've got this little list, and if you need to add anything in before that, feel free. One thing that we do in the shop when a bike comes in, every bike gets a compression check. At least 99% of them do, unless it's just, we know it's a really good running bike when it comes in and it might be getting other work done. We do a compression check. We check the spark. We check that it goes through all the gears. And if you can put it on a center stand and you can move the wheel back and forth and change out the gears, that'll give you a good idea. And then does it run and ride and stop already? And then the big dinger question would be, does it have a title or not? And that's a whole different show.
Yeah, that's true. It almost goes without saying that if you're looking at a motorcycle that's complicated to begin with, if it runs when you get there, that's always better than any other condition it could be in. Because if it's not running, you don't know what's going on with the battery. You don't know what's going on with the electrical system. You don't know what's going on with the fuel system. It may have other mechanical problems, and then it's complicated.
Yeah.
So your best choice is always a running motorcycle.
Right. Another thing you can do, I've got a little list here, is when you're wanting to get into the vintage motorcycle scene, it's not too bad to find a mentor, someone that's been around it, done that, kind of like Kim would be, or a Roger or a Keith Carlson, or I could name off a ton of guys, but find a mentor that is willing to help you kind of guide around your motorcycle and to figure out some problems.
One of the things at Hoy that we do is it's almost a value add if somebody calls and says, hey, can you guide me on this? And we'll give them straight guidance. I mean, it doesn't cost us anything to do that.
Yeah.
And if the customer is really concerned and needs some kind of direction, one of the things I'll caution everybody on is going out to Facebook or a forum. There's all kinds of expertise from high to low on the forums, and you might get opinions from people that don't necessarily line up with the facts. So I'm not going to hammer everybody that's on a motorcycle forum, but depending upon which forum you're on, there's a different character for every one of them. The Honda forums tend to have people with a lot more experience, in my opinion, because there's more Hondas out there. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, you can join some of the BMW forums. Can get a little scary if depending upon which bike it is. BMW owners, generally speaking, I don't want to be BMW-ist, but BMW owners are different than the owners of other bikes. And I think even BMW people will tell you that. And so if you're thinking about buying an old BMW, and we've had several of them come into the shop, guys want to have, even one guy with his very first
more
bike
than I ever thought would come in,
being a complicated
yeah.
BMW that he bought and not really thinking about what kind of budget's required to keep a BMW on the road, let alone get it on the road if it has issues. Right. You can buy it and think it's cheap at $2,000 or $2,500, and then find out that just to get it to work is going to be another $2,500 or $3,000, and now you've got $6,000 in a bike that's worth $4,000. You got to think about that.
Yeah, you can definitely get over the expense of the bike or what the bike's worth in a heartbeat, no matter what you do, especially on something like a resto mod or a rat bike or even a full restoration.
Resto mods are kind of a different animal because by the implication of it all by itself, you're thinking about changing the look of it, the parts on it. And anytime you do that, if you're going to make it work and ride, it's got to be done well. And if it's not done well, parts will fall off. They aren't going to fit the bike properly. The bike will have problems just because of that. It might even be dangerous. So when you're thinking about making modifications to a bike to do a resto mod, think about what those modifications are, because it gets really pricey if you change some things and you can't do it
sometimes
yourself.
The more crazy you go, you may just absolutely love it. It's not necessarily going to be very many other people's tastes.
Right. I think I mentioned it in one of our previous episodes. I just said, look, some guy on a forum out there is saying the first thing you should buy is a Brat CB500 because you'll make money selling it. And that might be true.
Maybe.
There's a snapshot of people out there that very definitely like those bikes and they pay a lot of money for them.
Right.
I'm not sure they're all happy with what they get.
Keith says, keep it original.
Yeah, I'm kind of a Nazi for that. I understand.
I like both,
I do too.
I mean, I like pure bikes and I like, I've done a couple resto mods. You've done several resto mods. Keith's done a ton of them.
Yeah.
And he's done originals and all that. And they all cost a lot of money to do.
Yeah, but for me, I don't think I'm that different than everybody else. I've had to come full circle back from stock bikes to changing bikes to stock again. I prefer a lot of the vintage bikes I have to be completely original. That's a hard thing to accomplish, but for me, it's what I prefer now. I haven't always preferred it because I've got a lot of modified bikes too. But I went through that phase of owning them when they were stock, not being happy, wanting to change it, then changing it, then not being happy with the change, then going back to stock. But it's a different animal depending on the bike.
I think for sure the highest percentage of your return for money is going to be probably with a stock bike, though.
No question about it. At least now for vintage bikes, if they're the more original they are, the better. For sure.
Let me go down through my notes here. Get comfortable with things going wrong. Vintage means old, and old means it will eventually break. Something's going to go, and it may be in the middle of your ride, or you might catch it before before you take off or after you get back. But if you have a vintage motorcycle, no matter what shape it is in, something's going to go wrong with it.
Yeah, dovetailing with that is, and when you do any work on any vehicle, it's significant work. There's a kind of a general rule of thumb out there where what you should do is you should take it on a 1 mile ride and come back and look at it, see what's going on. Then take it on a 5 mile ride, come back and look at it and see what's going on, and keep making your circles bigger and bigger until you get to about 20 or 30 miles. Then chances are it's going to have sorted itself out.
Yeah. We call that a shakedown.
Yeah.
If I want to do an analogy with or when I fly RC airplanes, they say to keep it high and tight. So if you keep it close to you and way up high, if something goes wrong, you have a chance to dead stick that and land it. Okay. If you have a bike that you're messing with, go out, do some laps in the neighborhood. And when it starts to prove itself, then you can go further out, and eventually maybe even go on a nice long, full day ride with it.
Yeah. And this might be obvious too, but when you get your first bike, the best advice is, even if it's running properly, don't immediately take it out and run it through the red line in the gearbox. That's going to be harmful potentially before you have it completely sorted. So don't run it 10/10. Tiptoe around for a little bit till you figure it out.
All right. Do your research. The more you learn about your new to you vintage bike, the more fun you'll have knowing that you can troubleshoot certain things. And there's about 100 shades of mechanical ability, and some have almost none, and some have a lot more than I'll ever have. And you just kind of gotta balance that out. And the other thing you have to have is you have to plan a budget. Just like anything else, vintage motorcycles or motorcycles in general is mostly a hobby. I mean, there are a lot of people that do commute to work and all that, but for the most part, it's a hobby.
Yeah, I think one thing that you have to consider also is, if you're going to buy a vintage bike, sometimes if you go on the lower end of it and you get a bike that's fairly roached, even if your plan is just to take it apart and learn what's going on, that can be a valuable exercise, even if you wind up giving the parts away or throwing it away or whatever. Because you're going to learn something by getting in there and getting your hands dirty. You might learn at least that it's either for you or not for you to get that deep in it.
Right. Brian Graney has a good thought here. I've mentioned this many times to new motorcycle riders, new vintage motorcycle riders, and that's to have some type of an insurance where you can get towed for free. AAA is it AAA? Yeah. If
you're using some of the, like Haggerty, for example, this could be a Haggerty commercial for me because they've been great for me.
I never even knew they had towing insurance on because I have it.
They'll do a number of things. If you use Haggerty, you have the ability to insure it when it's in parts. You don't even have to have a whole motorcycle.
Yeah.
So you can put a value on it, pay your insurance like that. They declare value, and they have roadside assistance and stuff like that for once the bike.
When I was young, my mom always put AAA on me, and anytime I broke down, you can get towed basically for free up to a certain amount of miles.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a commercial from Andrew.
Oh, what do we got there? Okay. Yeah. Let's do that. What's up, Andrew? Andrew bought, I think it was a 68 or 69 BMW, and we pretty much did a full restoration on that.
Yeah, it was a
bad boy.
It was a complimentary to it was already a very good bike. It just needed a little bit of TLC, and it was terrific when it was done. Mike did a great job on it.
Yep. All right. When is too expensive to fully restore? Let's see. When is it too expensive to fully restore or mildly restore a vintage motorcycle?
I had that conversation with somebody today, actually.
Was that the
CB100? No, it was a CB100. The guy brought it in. He had it when he was 18 years old. When he went off to college, he gave it to a friend to keep. His friend wasn't particularly diligent in taking care of it. And when he brought it to us, he said he had a $400 budget. and wanted to get it to run and ride and stop and all that. And at first glance, it looked pretty much like this. You know, I mean, 10 feet away, it looked like it was complete. And he was complaining that the Kickstarter was stuck down. And I said, well, we'll take a look at it and see what's going on. Eventually, I had to call him up and tell him not only was the engine seized, but there was rust inside the cylinder. It had sat outside, it got wet. The carburetor was seized. The bike had the turn signals broken off of it. There was a crappy cream job inside the gas tank. I explained to him that, you know, you can go out and buy a motorcycle just like this that's cosmetically nice and working for somewhere between $800 and $2,000, depending upon the condition. But you're going to easily spend $2,000 just bringing this one back to running. And that might not be the best choice. So, you know, you don't want to spend more money unless, and we've had this happen many times, you're emotionally attached to it for some reason, and therefore cost is only a secondary consideration. We've had a guy put $25,000 in a $5,000 motorcycle, but he wanted that one. I understand that. We're more than happy to do that for you if that's your plan, but not always a good idea unless we, you know, full disclosure, tell them you could buy a nice bike for way less than you're paying to fix it.
Well, that's where doing your research will give you a little bit of a chance. If you know that a bike is worth between, you know, $3,000 and $8,000, and you buy one for, you know, we get this a lot. Oh, I only paid $200 for it, but it looks like it was drug up out of a river. You're going to put thousands in it, and then still may not even quite be there.
Yeah, the thing I had to explain to this gentleman today was the gas tank has a crappy cream job in it, so it was not prepared properly to begin with. That means that in order to fix it properly, you've got to take it to a chemical stripper. They've got to go inside the tank and outside the tank, and to get it back in a good condition, it's going to have to be stripped out. Then it's going to have to be repainted. Once all that's done, he's going to have $400 or $500 in a gas tank, and the bike's probably worth less than that. So you might want to think about that.
Yeah, a lot of the same costs that you would have on a newer bike are very similar to an older bike. But you know, most of the shops they've got an hourly rate, 80, $90 an hour, and you know, it kind of is what it is. It takes what it takes. To get
from a vintage point of view, though, one of the reasons why there's so many of these bikes out there is that they weren't very expensive to buy in the first place in the 60s and 70s. And if you bought one, you maybe didn't give it a lot of attention or maintain it properly. If you buy a new bike, you're going to pay a fair amount of money for it. You're probably going to try to maintain it fairly. It's a different thing than it was back in the day when people were buying Hondas for, you could buy a brand new Super 90 for like $350 or something like that back in 66 and 67. Right. I remember CB 750s in 1969 were $1,400. You know, now you're lucky to find anything like that for less than 20 grand. You know, it's a different world.
Yeah, these CB 750s, not necessarily this particular one, but these were $1,200 new.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, and that particular bike, because it's unrestored, and it's the first generation of the motorcycle, is worth about $20,000-$25,000.
Yeah, I would say somewhere. Yeah, it's somewhere in the 18 to 20.
Yep.
And then you've got your replica version of that.
Yeah, that's a clone I built out of a different bike because I'd done a couple of 69s and 70s, and I had enough parts left over to do one that looked like one. So you could probably buy that bike, not from me necessarily, but you could buy one like it for about 10, 12,000.
Now, the most popular bike you were talking about, this is the early version of it. So this would be like a 68 or 69.
Yep.
But they made these from about 68 to
I think 74
mid-70s.
And 75, I think they became 360s.
And you can get into a nice running, riding vintage CB 350 for $1,500 to $2,500, and
maybe not that one shape. Because it's not an OG.
That particular one. Yeah.
On the other hand, I was telling
very much like this.
We were talking about this before we went on live. In 1973, I think the year, Honda made more CB 350s than all the other motorcycle manufacturers made combined.
Right.
And that's just that particular model. So I don't know what the number was ultimately, but it was something like 500,000. So it was a lot.
Right. Well, so we're going to wrap it up. We're about 30 minutes here. So we're going to try to keep these shows. I've got a vintage Moto tip of the day, actually a couple here. We had a crusty KLR 650 exhaust come in, and it had some rusty screws, and so I sprayed them with a little bit of Croil, and then I actually used your impact drill, your little cordless impact drill. And we'll have to give a shout out to Brett Johnson for kind of giving us this this tip when he was working for us. He used this all the time to take off your engine covers, your side covers, any type of screw that's kind of rusty crusty. If you put a little Croil on it and zap it with the cordless impact drill, it works wonders.
And one little adjunct to that is that make sure you have JIS screwdriver tips.
Yeah, definitely get the right tip.
Yeah, get the right tips, because if you're using a regular old Phillips head screwdriver, it'll strip it out.
Safety tip of the day: keep your eyes moving, look ahead. Even though you might think you've gained eye contact with someone, they still might not even be looking at you. They might be looking past you and still pull out in front of you. So that's our safety tip of the day. And we'll see you next time on Moto Talk with Steve and Kim. Hope you enjoyed it. Send us some feedback, comments, click subscribe, all that jazz.
Send us some things you want to talk about.
That's right. We'll talk to you later.